Welcome to BookBound Audio, where stories come alive. Today, we invite you to step into the gripping world of mystery, suspense, and untold truths as we uncover a tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Set against the backdrop of 1960s America, this immersive journey delves deep into human motivations, unraveling a web of secrets with shocking twists and compelling characters. Grab your headphones, settle in, and let the story unfold. Set in 1961, in the quiet town of Stonebridge, The Poisoned Truth follows the intricate investigation of a murder that shakes the community to its core. Elliot Brooks, a renowned private detective known for his razor-sharp observations and martial arts expertise, is hired to solve the case. Through the eyes of Miguel Vasquez, Elliot's trusted friend and narrator, we delve into the darkness lurking beneath the town's surface. As they uncover layers of corruption and deceit, the story challenges the boundaries of justice and morality. Prepare for an unforgettable tale of suspense, twists, and revelations. Elliot Brooks had a way of commanding a room without ever raising his voice. As we walked into the Stonebridge Civic Hall that morning, the remnants of last night's televised debate were still visible, a podium tipped at an awkward angle, chairs left in disarray, and a lingering tension that clung to the air. It was quiet now, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights, but the place bore the unmistakable scars of discord. I trailed a step behind him, adjusting my satchel as I observed our surroundings. Being a history teacher had made me acutely aware of spaces like these, rooms where ideas collided, where conflict etched itself into the walls, invisible but palpable. But today wasn't about the past, not entirely. It was about Arthur Wade, the man whose voice had been silenced before he could finish making his case. "He sat here," Elliot muttered, gesturing toward a chair near the center of the stage. He knelt, running his fingers along its armrest as if it could whisper secrets to him. The poisoning wouldn't have happened until he took his second sip of water, correct? "That's what Eleanor said," I replied, my voice bouncing off the bare walls. "She mentioned it was during the rebuttal." He took a sip, hesitated, like he noticed something was off, and then took another. Elliot nodded absently, his piercing blue eyes scanning the floor around the chair. His gaze was clinical, precise, and utterly detached, like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. It was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in my mind. Arthur Wade had been a beacon for many, myself included, a man who spoke with unflinching clarity about the inequalities that plagued our country. Seeing his life reduced to an investigation made my stomach churn. "Check the podium, Miguel," Elliot said, breaking my reverie. "See if there's any residue near the microphone." The glass was likely placed on top during the break. Whoever poisoned it wouldn't have had much time. I nodded, walking toward the stage. The podium stood like a sentry, its wooden surface scarred by years of use. I ran my hand along its edge, feeling for anything out of place. It was instinctive, something I'd picked up from watching Elliot over the years. My fingertips brushed against something grainy, and I leaned closer. A faint white residue clung to the base of the microphone, almost imperceptible. "Elliot," I called, stepping back to let him examine it. He approached with the fluid grace of someone who always knew where he was going, crouching to inspect the substance. He pulled a small vial from his coat pocket, scraping a sample into it with practiced ease. "Interesting," he murmured. "It's crystalline. Likely arsenic-based, but I'll need to confirm." "Arsenic?" I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "That's archaic, isn't it?" "It's effective," he replied, standing. "And it leaves just enough trace to send a message without being immediately detectable." The question is, who had the opportunity? Before I could respond, the sharp clack of heels echoed through the hall. Eleanor Wade appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. She was a striking woman, tall, with a presence that demanded attention even in grief. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her hands were clenched around a clutch that seemed too small to contain the weight she carried. "Mrs. Wade," Elliot greeted, his tone softening. "Thank you for meeting us here." "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" she replied, her voice brittle. She glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the stage. "This is where it happened?" "It is," I answered, stepping forward. "We're doing everything we can to figure out who's responsible." Her gaze shifted to me, and for a moment, I saw something crack in her veneer. Grief, raw and unfiltered, flickered in her eyes before she blinked it away. "Arthur was a good man," she said. "He didn't deserve this." "No, he didn't," Elliot agreed. "But the person who did this wanted to make a statement. It wasn't just about silencing him, it was about sending a message to everyone he represented." "Do you know of anyone who might have wanted him gone?" Eleanor hesitated, her grip tightening on the clutch. "He had enemies," she admitted. "Anyone who stood for what he did would. But there's one person who's been particularly vocal." "Who?" Elliot pressed. "Victor Hartwell," she said, the name like a stone dropped into a still pond. "He's a local businessman. Owns half the factories in town. He's been funding campaigns against integration for years. Arthur called him out during the last debate. It got heated." I exchanged a glance with Elliot. Hartwell's name wasn't unfamiliar. He was a figure of wealth and influence in Stonebridge, known for his staunch opposition to progress. But to go so far as murder? It was a leap, even for someone like him. "We'll need to speak with him," Elliot said, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Mrs. Wade. Your cooperation is invaluable." She nodded, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her grief had finally caught up with her. "Just find out who did this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Make sure they pay." With that, she turned and walked out of the hall, her heels clicking a samba rhythm against the floor. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as we left the civic hall, the streets of Stonebridge eerily quiet. It was a town caught between eras, a place where the past clung stubbornly to the present, refusing to let go. As we walked toward Elliot's car, my mind churned with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. "Do you believe her?" I asked as we slid into the vehicle. "I believe she's telling the truth as she sees it," Elliot replied, starting the engine. "But truth is a malleable thing, Miguel. People see what they want to see." "Do you think Hartwell did it?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He stared straight ahead, his hand steady on the wheel. "I think Hartwell has a lot to lose if Stonebridge changes," he said finally. "And people with something to lose are capable of anything." We drove in silence, the weight of the investigation settling over us like a shroud. As we pulled up to Hartwell's estate, a sprawling mansion perched on the edge of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into the lion's den. The gates loomed before us, ornate and imposing, a testament to the power and privilege that Hartwell wielded. Elliot parked the car and turned to me. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low. "People like Hartwell don't appreciate being questioned. We need to tread carefully." I nodded, swallowing the unease that threatened to creep up my throat. Together, we approached the gates, the first steps in unraveling the poisoned truth. The iron gates of Victor Hartwell's estate creaked open with a deliberate slowness, as though relishing the act of admitting us into its domain. The grandeur of the property was almost garish, endless rows of hedges trimmed with surgical precision, fountains that seemed frozen in mid-splash, and a sprawling mansion that loomed like a monument to excess. Elliot strode forward with the calm confidence of a man who had walked into countless dens of power and deceit, while I hung back, trying to suppress a creeping unease. A butler with sharp features and an even sharper suit met us at the door. His expression was one of polite disinterest, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity as they settled on Elliot. "Mr. Hartwell is expecting you," the butler said, his voice clipped. "Follow me." The interior of the mansion was no less ostentatious than its exterior. Marble floors gleamed under the light of an elaborate crystal chandelier, and the walls were adorned with portraits of what I could only assume were Hartwell's ancestors, each one staring down with an air of disapproval. As we were led through the halls, I couldn't help but feel like an intruder in a world that was as foreign to me as it was unwelcoming. Hartwell was waiting for us in a study that seemed torn from the pages of a Gothic novel. Dark wood paneling, shelves crammed with leather-bound tomes, and a massive desk that dominated the room. The man himself was seated behind it, a cigar smoldering between his fingers. He was a broad-shouldered figure in his late 50s, with a square jaw and eyes that sparkled with an unsettling combination of charm and menace. "Mr. Brooks, I presume," Hartwell said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to fill the room. "And you must be his associate." "Miguel Vasquez," I supplied, resisting the urge to fidget under his gaze. "Ah," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A teacher, yes? My housekeeper's son attended your class, I believe." It took me a moment to realize he was referring to one of my students, a quiet boy who rarely spoke but always handed in immaculate assignments. Before I could respond, Elliot stepped forward, his tone polite but unyielding. "Mr. Hartwell, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us," Elliot began. "We're investigating the circumstances surrounding Arthur Wade's death, and we understand you were present at the debate." Hartwell leaned back in his chair, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Tragic business," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Arthur and I had our differences, but I wouldn't wish that on anyone." Differences that became quite public during the debate, Elliot pressed, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Hartwell chuckled, a low sound that made my skin crawl. "Public discourse can get heated, Mr. Brooks. That doesn't mean I poisoned the man." Elliot didn't react to the deflection, his expression remaining unreadable. "You were seen speaking with one of the staff members shortly before the debate. Can you tell us what that was about?" Hartwell's eyes flickered, a brief but telling sign. "I spoke with many people that evening," he said. "As I always do. Networking is an essential part of my business." I glanced at Elliot, noting the subtle shift in his posture, a telltale sign that he'd caught onto something. "Of course," Elliot said smoothly. "But this particular staff member reported feeling uneasy after your conversation. Care to elaborate?" Hartwell's expression darkened, the veneer of charm slipping for just a moment. "I don't appreciate being accused, Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice cold. "If you have evidence, present it. Otherwise, I suggest you focus your investigation elsewhere." Elliot held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "We're simply following the evidence, Mr. Hartwell. Thank you for your time." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving me scrambling to follow. As we stepped back into the hallway, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. Hartwell was watching us, his expression inscrutable but unmistakably calculating. Outside, the air felt heavy, laden with the scent of freshly mowed grass and the faint hum of cicadas. Elliot didn't speak as we made our way back to the car, his face set in a mask of concentration. I waited until we were inside and the engine had roared to life before breaking the silence. "You believe him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He's lying about something," Elliot replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Whether it's directly tied to Wade's death remains to be seen." I nodded, my mind racing through the implications. "Do you think he had someone else do it? Someone who wouldn't be traced back to him?" "It's a possibility," Elliot said. "But we need more than speculation. That residue we found at the Civic Hall might give us a lead." "We'll head to the lab." The lab was a modest facility tucked away in a quiet part of town. It belonged to an old acquaintance of Elliot's, a forensic analyst named Dr. Clara Hensley. She was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp wit and an even sharper mind, and her skills had proven invaluable in more than one investigation. Clara greeted us with a raised eyebrow as we entered, her hand stained with what looked like ink from a previous experiment. "Brooks," she said, her tone equal parts exasperation and amusement. "What have you dragged in this time?" "Arsenic, possibly," Elliot replied, handing her the vial. "Can you confirm?" Clara's expression sobered as she took the sample, her fingers brushing against Elliot's for the briefest moment. "Give me an hour," she said. "And don't touch anything while you're here." She disappeared into the back room, leaving Elliot and me to wait in the small, cluttered lobby. The minutes stretched on, the silence broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. I found myself pacing, my mind replaying the events of the day. "What if we're wrong?" I asked suddenly, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "What if we're chasing shadows?" Elliot looked up from the notebook he'd been scribbling in, his expression thoughtful. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, Miguel," he said. "We just have to know where to look." Before I could respond, Clara returned, holding a printout in one hand and the now empty vial in the other. "It's arsenic," she confirmed. "But it's mixed with a compound I haven't seen before. Something designed to delay the effects until ingestion." "A timed poison," Elliot murmured, his brow furrowing. "Sophisticated." Clara nodded. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. This isn't the work of an amateur." I felt a chill run down my spine. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more disturbing than I'd anticipated. Elliot took the printout, studying it intently before tucking it into his coat. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "Your help, as always, is invaluable." She waved him off, though I caught the faintest hint of a smile. "Just don't let this one get you killed, Brooks," she said, her tone only half joking. Elliot didn't respond, his focus already elsewhere. As we stepped back into the cool evening air, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something far larger than we'd anticipated, something that would test us in ways neither of us could foresee. The morning light spilled over Stonebridge in muted streaks, softening the sharp edges of the town's buildings, but doing little to quell the unease that had settled over me like an unwelcome shadow. Elliot's demeanor betrayed no trace of hesitation as we prepared to investigate further. His calm, measured steps contrasted with the restless energy knotting my stomach. A mystery was unraveling before us, intricate and dark, and I could only wonder what new threads we would tug loose today. Our first stop was the Civic Archives, an unassuming brick structure tucked away in the older part of town. Elliot had insisted we comb through any records or correspondence tied to Arthur Wade's activism, a task that fell largely to me as Elliot busied himself with other leads. He believed that a paper trail, no matter how faint, might hold clues to motives or connections that could lead us closer to the truth. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. Inside, the scent of aged paper and faded ink greeted us, a sharp contrast to the glossy facades of Stonebridge wealthier enclaves. The archivist, a bespectacled man whose neatly combed hair seemed to be at odds with his rumpled shirt, directed us to the relevant sections with a faint air of reluctance. I imagined he wasn't accustomed to dealing with private detectives or their companions. Elliot gave me a curt nod before disappearing among the stacks, leaving me alone with the towering shelves and their labyrinthine contents. I began sorting through boxes of documents labeled with an array of dates and shorthand notations, each one a testament to the lives and struggles that had shaped the town. Newspaper clippings chronicling local protests, meeting minutes from community organizations, letters exchanged between Wade and his supporters. It was all there, a tapestry of resistance against the forces that sought to stifle progress. Among these, a particular letter caught my attention. Its envelope was worn, the ink smudged in places, but the content itself was legible. Wade had written to a fellow activist, detailing threats he had received following a heated town hall meeting. The threats, vague but ominous, mentioned the wrath of Stonebridge true guardians. It wasn't difficult to interpret the message. It spoke to power, to individuals who viewed Wade's advocacy as an affront to their interests. I copied the details into my notebook, the implications gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Were these so-called guardians responsible for Wade's death? And if so, how far did their reach extend? Elliot emerged from the stacks shortly after, his expression focused but slightly shadowed. "Find anything?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected I had. I handed him the notebook, watching as his gaze flicked over my notes. "Interesting," he muttered. "This aligns with a lead I picked up last night." "What lead?" I asked, the question spilling out before I could stop myself. He didn't answer immediately, instead pocketing the notebook and motioning for me to follow him out of the archives. "We're paying the factory a visit," he said, his voice low but determined. The factory loomed over us like a sleeping beast, its rusted walls streaked with grime and its windows clouded with years of neglect. Despite its state of disrepair, it was clear the place held secrets, the kind that didn't take kindly to prying eyes. Elliot approached the foreman at the entrance, his stance firm but unthreatening. It was a tactic I'd seen him employ countless times: disarm with composure, then strike with precision. The foreman, a gruff man whose face seemed permanently etched with suspicion, eyed Elliot warily. "What do you want?" he barked, his tone more accusatory than questioning. "Information," Elliot replied, his voice steady. "We're investigating the poisoning of Arthur Wade. We understand he visited this factory recently." The foreman's expression flickered, just for a moment, but enough to catch Elliot's attention. "Wade didn't have any business here," he said gruffly. "And neither do you." Elliot didn't flinch. "Then you won't mind if we look around?" "I do mind," the foreman snapped, stepping closer. "This is private property." The tension was palpable, but Elliot held his ground. "We're not here to disrupt operations," he said evenly. "Just to ask questions." Surely that's not too much to ask. The foreman hesitated, his scowl deepening. Finally, he gestured toward the building with a curt nod. "Make it quick." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, the clanging of machinery echoing through the cavernous space. Workers moved about with practiced efficiency, their faces marked by exhaustion and resignation. It was a world removed from the debates and protests Wade had championed, but one that felt intrinsically tied to his cause. Elliot's eye scanned the room, his movements deliberate. He approached a cluster of crates stacked near the far wall, examining them with the same precision he'd shown at the Civic Hall. I followed suit, my own search less systematic but no less intent. It was among the crates that Elliot found the clue, a scrap of paper tucked beneath the lid of one, its edges curled with age. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, and the words themselves chilling. "They're watching. Protect yourself." Elliot pocketed the note, his expression unreadable. "The plot thickens," he said softly, more to himself than to me. We continued our search, finding other fragments of evidence, tools that seemed out of place, stains on the floor that bore a faint metallic odor. Each discovery added another layer to the puzzle, but none offered the clarity we sought. As we prepared to leave, a voice called out behind us. "You won't find anything here." We turned to see a woman standing near the entrance, her arms crossed and her gaze unwavering. She was young, with an air of defiance that seemed to challenge the very walls around her. "And why is that?" Elliot asked, his tone measured. "Because you're looking in the wrong place," she replied, her voice steady. "If Wade had enemies, they weren't here. They were above." "Above?" I echoed, the word feeling heavier than it should. "The ones who think they run this town," she clarified. "Hartwell, and people like him. They pull the strings." Elliot studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said simply. As we left the factory, the weight of the investigation pressed down on me like a physical force. The clues were there, scattered like fragments of a broken mirror, but the picture they formed was still murky. Elliot, as always, seemed unfazed, his resolve unwavering. "You think she's right?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Possibly," he replied. "But truth has many layers, Miguel. We need to peel them back one at a time." And so we drove into the deepening shadows of Stonebridge, the poisoned truth waiting to be unearthed. The steady rhythm of Elliot's footsteps alongside mine was a sound I had grown accustomed to. It was almost like a metronome guiding us through the dissonance of Stonebridge secrets. That morning, we set our sights on the mansion of another local figure, Carlton Greaves, a wealthy developer and one of Victor Hartwell's closest associates. If Hartwell had been evasive and insistent in his denials, Greaves presented a new layer to peel back. Elliot had spent the night poring over the notes and fragments we'd gathered. The unsettling message from the factory now burned in my memory. "They're watching. Protect yourself." As the morning sun filtered through a thin veil of clouds, Stonebridge seemed to hold its breath, watching us as we trudged toward the answers that refused to reveal themselves outright. Greaves's home was surprisingly understated for a man with the financial clout he boasted. The house sprawled outward rather than upward, its facade marked by pale stone and oversized windows. As we approached, Elliot's pace slowed just slightly, a subtle change that meant he was already observing every detail. The landscape around the house, the pattern of curtains in the windows, the faint tremor of an upstairs light, a checklist of signs that only Elliot seemed to grasp. The knock on the door felt louder than it should have. Elliot stood steady, waiting, while I shifted my satchel to one side. My nerves had begun to fray, but I reminded myself that Elliot always knew what he was walking into. It was what made him so infuriatingly unreadable and, at the same time, reassuringly precise. After a long pause, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man wearing an expensive suit that seemed to strain against his wide frame. His grey hair was combed back meticulously, and his expression hovered somewhere between boredom and disdain. "Mr. Brooks," the man said before casting his gaze my way, "and Mr. Vasquez, I presume?" I glanced at Elliot, startled by the recognition. Elliot inclined his head slightly, his response cool but polite. "Mr. Greaves, thank you for agreeing to meet us." Greaves stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. "I don't have much time," he said, his voice gruff. "Make this quick." The interior of the home was a study in muted luxury, rich mahogany furniture, polished floors, and artwork that I suspected was more valuable than I could comprehend. Despite the elegance, there was something sterile about the space, like it had been assembled with intent but lacked a soul. Greaves led us to a sitting room lined with bookshelves, his movements deliberate and rigid. "State your business," he said as he settled into an armchair, his hands clasped tightly. Elliot didn't hesitate. "We're investigating the poisoning of Arthur Wade. We understand you've had dealings with Mr. Hartwell, and we're exploring potential connections." Greaves snorted. "Victor likes to think he's at the center of everything," he said dismissively. "But he's far less influential than he lets on. And yet, he's influential enough that his name keeps surfacing," Elliot replied. "Arthur Wade made no secret of his opposition to your group's activities. Do you believe that opposition might have made him a target?" Greaves leaned back, his lips curving into what could only be described as a smirk. "Target? Wade was a troublemaker, but a target? That's absurd." I couldn't stop myself from speaking up. "Does that mean you disagreed with Hartwell's methods? His campaigns against Wade?" Greaves's gaze flicked toward me, sharp and calculating. "I don't involve myself in Victor's schemes. I stick to my business." "And what is your business, Mr. Greaves?" Elliot asked, his tone deceptively mild. Greaves's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Development. Real estate. I shape Stonebridge's future." "Then you must care about its people," Elliot said. "Including individuals like Arthur Wade, who stood for progress." Greaves's hands tightened just slightly, a gesture so small I nearly missed it. "Wade was naive," he said finally. "Stonebridge doesn't need idealists. It needs pragmatists." Elliot let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed on Greaves. The tension in the room thickened until Greaves shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You're barking up the wrong tree," he muttered. "Victor might know more about Wade than I do." Elliot nodded, as if conceding the point, though I suspected he wasn't convinced. "Thank you, Mr. Greaves. We appreciate your time." Greaves waved a dismissive hand as we rose to leave, his expression souring. "Don't bother me again." Back outside, the air felt cleaner somehow, though the weight of the conversation clung to me like smoke. Elliot walked briskly toward the car, his expression unreadable. Once inside, I finally broke the silence. "You think he's involved?" Elliot shook his head, though not in denial. "He knows more than he lets on. Greaves might not have directly orchestrated Wade's murder, but he understands the system that allowed it to happen." "The wrath of Stonebridge's true guardians," I murmured, recalling Wade's letter. "Exactly," Elliot replied. "Greaves is one of them, whether he admits it or not." We drove through the streets of Stonebridge, the car humming softly beneath us. My thoughts churned as the town passed by in muted colors and fleeting shapes. Stonebridge was beautiful in its way, but its charm seemed hollow now, like a veil hiding something sinister. Our next stop took us to the local community center, a hub of activity in Wade's activism. If the Civic Hall had been the site of his tragic end, the community center was where his legacy lived. Posters for past rallies adorned the walls, and a table near the entrance held brochures advocating for equality and justice. The space was alive with purpose, even in Wade's absence. A young woman greeted us at the front desk, her eyes bright but wary. "Can I help you?" she asked. "We're looking into Arthur Wade's death," Elliot said. "We'd like to speak to anyone who worked closely with him." The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking between us before nodding. "Follow me." She led us to a small office at the back of the center where an older man was seated, his silver hair shining under the fluorescent light. He looked up as we entered, his expression softening as he recognized Elliot. "Elliot Brooks," the man said warmly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Mr. Darrow," Elliot replied, shaking his hand. "Thank you for meeting with us." Darrow motioned for us to sit, his movement slow but deliberate. "Arthur was a good man," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "I still can't believe he's gone." Elliot nodded, his tone respectful. "We're trying to understand what led to his death." "Was there anyone you believe might have had reason to harm him?" Darrow sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Arthur had enemies, no doubt. The more he pushed for change, the more resistance he met. But murder? That takes a different kind of hatred." "Did he ever mention threats? Concerns for his safety?" Elliot asked. Darrow paused, his gaze distant. "He said he felt watched sometimes. Like someone was waiting for him to slip. But he never let it stop him." "Who would have wanted him silenced?" I asked. Darrow's eyes hardened, his grief giving way to resolve. "The people who fear change. The ones who profit from division. They'll stop at nothing to keep their hold on this town." As we left the community center, Darrow's words rang in my ears. Stonebridge true guardians were watching, protecting themselves, and we were stepping closer to their line of sight. Elliot's silence spoke volumes, his focus unyielding as we prepared for the next move. Stonebridge held its breath, and so did I. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the streets of Stonebridge, casting an air of unease over the town as Elliot and I made our way toward our next destination, the home of the retired historian whom Elliot insisted I meet. Elliot believed the man might hold answers hidden beneath layers of Stonebridge's history, clues that would illuminate the motives behind Arthur Wade's murder. I wasn't entirely convinced, but one thing I'd learned about Elliot Brooks was to never underestimate the value of his instincts. He had a habit of being right. The historian's home was an old Victorian house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, its paint peeling and garden overrun. The place had the kind of charm only time could give, a charm that whispered tales of forgotten stories and unseen tragedies. As Elliot knocked on the door, I couldn't help but feel the weight of those unspoken histories pressing down on me. The door creaked open to reveal an elderly man with stooped shoulders and a neatly trimmed silver beard. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, surveyed us for a moment before he smiled faintly. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice gravelly but warm, "I've been expecting you." "And my colleague," Elliot added, motioning to me. "Miguel Vasquez. He's a historian himself." The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on me with a touch of curiosity. "Ah, a fellow keeper of stories. Come in, both of you." We stepped inside, the smell of old books and polished wood greeting us like an embrace. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with volumes of every size and color, some so aged their spines were barely legible. A large oak table sat at the center of the room, covered in papers and maps. I felt an instant connection to the space. It reminded me of my own modest office at the college, though it lacked the grandeur this room exuded. "I'm Everett Giles," the man said as he gestured for us to sit. "And you're here about Arthur Wade, I presume?" Elliot nodded, his expression as unreadable as ever. "We're trying to understand the forces at play behind his murder. We believe history may hold the answers." Giles chuckled softly, settling into his chair across from us. "History always holds answers, Mr. Brooks. The question is whether you're prepared to hear them." Elliot's gaze sharpened, but he remained silent, allowing Giles to continue. "Stonebridge has always been a town divided," Giles began, his voice steady. "Its wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few, while the rest are left to fight for scraps. Arthur Wade threatened that balance. He was a disruptor, a catalyst for change. But disruptors rarely live long in places like this." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "You've seen this pattern before?" Giles nodded, his eyes distant. "More times than I care to count." Wade's murder was no isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of tension, the result of an unspoken pact among Stonebridge's elite to maintain control at any cost. "Do you believe they orchestrated his death?" Elliot asked, his tone measured. Giles hesitated, his gaze flicking to the papers on the table. "I don't have proof," he admitted. "But I can show you patterns, connections that suggest the guardians of Stonebridge, as they've been called, will stop at nothing to protect their interests." He slid a map across the table, its surface marked with red ink. "This is a timeline of incidents tied to the town's elite," he explained. "Each mark represents a moment when someone opposed them and paid the price." I studied the map, my pulse quickening as the implications sank in. The marks were far too numerous to dismiss as coincidence, each one a thread leading back to the same figures we'd begun investigating. Hartwell, Greaves, and now others whose names we hadn't yet uncovered. "Arthur's name should have been added here," Giles said, his voice soft but firm. "But it's not just his story. It's a story repeated through generations." Elliot's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the information. "And what do you believe happened the night of Wade's murder?" Giles sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I believe someone acted on behalf of the elite, a proxy sent to silence him before he could rally the town." "A proxy," I repeated, the word sinking in like a stone. "Someone outside their immediate circle, someone who could be discarded if necessary." Giles nodded. "Exactly. The poison was too sophisticated to be traced back to an amateur, but the act itself was meant to appear messy, personal, a warning to those who might follow in Wade's footsteps." The room fell silent, the weight of Giles's words pressing down on us. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Giles. Your insight is invaluable." Giles smiled faintly, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "I hope it helps," he said. "But be careful, Mr. Brooks. The guardians of Stonebridge have eyes everywhere." As we stepped back into the fading light of day, I couldn't shake the feeling that Giles's home had been more than a refuge for old stories. It had been a glimpse into the dark undercurrents of Stonebridge, the threads that bound its history together in ways both sinister and undeniable. Elliot didn't speak as we walked to the car, his gaze distant. I waited until we were driving back toward the town center before breaking the silence. "What do you make of it?" I asked, though I already knew his mind was racing with possibilities. "I think Giles is right," he replied, his tone quiet but firm. Wade's death was no accident, no random act. It was deliberate, a message meant to echo through the community. And the proxy? I pressed. How do we find them? Elliot glanced at me, his expression sharp. We start with those who might benefit most from Wade's absence. Hartwell, Greaves, and others yet to be named. Giles gave us the framework. Now we fill in the gaps. I nodded, though the enormity of the task weighed heavily on me. Stonebridge was a town steeped in secrets, its guardians hidden behind masks of civility. As we drove through its quiet streets, I couldn't help but wonder how deep those secrets ran, and what it would take to uncover them. The shadows of Stonebridge loomed large, and we were stepping further into their depths with every passing moment. The morning air in Stonebridge was cold and crisp as Elliot and I made our way toward the address scrawled on the back of Everett Giles's map. After digging through the layers of riddles and warnings Giles had presented, Elliot had decided our next step was to locate a former town employee who had been dismissed under suspicious circumstances years ago. This man, Rupert Calloway, was rumored to have been deeply involved in managing finances for Hartwell's ventures, and if the whispers we'd heard were true, he'd fallen out of favor when a scandal threatened to surface. Elliot hadn't said much since our conversation with Giles, and while his silence usually meant his mind was working through its own intricate puzzles, it left me with more questions than answers. The weight of everything we'd uncovered so far felt heavier than ever. Arthur Wade's death was no longer just about the act itself, it was becoming the thread that connected decades of manipulation and exploitation, all hidden under a veneer of civility. The address led us to the outskirts of town, where houses were smaller, older, and less maintained. Calloway's home was little more than a bungalow with peeling paint and a yard overrun by weeds. As we approached, I caught sight of a man sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette and watching us with an expression that hovered between suspicion and resignation. He looked to be in his 60s, his face lined with the marks of hard years, though there was something about his sharp gaze that suggested he hadn't lost his edge. "Mr. Calloway," Elliot said as we reached the porch, his tone calm and unassuming. "I'm Elliot Brooks. This is Miguel Vasquez. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Calloway took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly before replying. "Questions about what?" "Victor Hartwell," Elliot answered. "And the systems he's built around Stonebridge. We believe you may have insights that could help us." Calloway studied us for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Hartwell? Haven't thought about that bastard in years. Don't care to start now." "It's about Arthur Wade," I added, stepping forward. "He was murdered during the debate last week. Poisoned. We're trying to figure out who's responsible." Something flickered in Calloway's expression, a brief crack in his demeanor before he recovered. "Wade, hey," he said, stubbing out his cigarette on the armrest of his chair. "Shame what happened to him. Man had guts, I'll give him that." "Did you know him?" Elliot asked. Calloway shook his head. "Never met the guy, but I followed his work. Took on the big players like Hartwell and Greaves. You don't do that without consequences." Elliot nodded, his gaze steady. "Which is why we're here. You worked for Hartwell. You know how his operations function. We believe Wade's murder was tied to the networks Hartwell has built." Calloway let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Networks? Who?" "That's a polite way to put it. You want the truth. Hartwell's got his fingers in everything: finance, real estate, politics. And he's got people willing to do his dirty work. People like you? I asked before I could stop myself. Calloway shot me a sharp look, but there was no anger behind it, just weariness. I was a pawn, kid. Did what I was told because I needed the paycheck. When the scandal hit, Hartwell tossed me aside like yesterday's trash. What scandal? Elliot pressed. Calloway hesitated, his gaze dropping to the porch floor. Embezzlement, he said finally. Hartwell's money wasn't as clean as he liked people to think. There were payments to folks who weren't supposed to exist, funds shifted around to cover up, well, you get the idea. Elliot's eyes narrowed slightly. And Wade's murder? Calloway sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Look, I don't have proof. But if you're asking me if Hartwell's capable of having someone killed, the answer's yes. He's smart enough not to get his hands dirty, but he's got plenty of people who owe him favors. Before Elliot could respond, Calloway glanced up sharply, his expression hardening. I hope you know what you're getting into. Hartwell doesn't take kindly to people poking around in his business. Elliot didn't flinch. We're willing to take the risk. Calloway studied him for a long moment before nodding. I'll help you if I can, he said. But you'd better be careful. People like Hartwell play a long game, and they don't lose. As we left Calloway's home, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his warning pressing down on me. Elliot's demeanor remained calm, but I knew him well enough to recognize the shift in his focus. He was zeroing in, sharpening his senses for what was to come. Our next stop was the local diner, a place Wade had frequented for meetings with supporters. Elliot believed we might find someone willing to share information about Wade's activities leading up to the debate. The diner was bustling when we arrived, the smell of coffee and fried food hanging in the air as patrons chatted and waitresses moved between tables. Elliot's attention was immediately drawn to a man sitting alone in a corner booth, his expression tense as he studied the newspaper in front of him. Elliot motioned for me to follow, and we approached the booth with deliberate steps. Mind if we join you? Elliot asked, his tone polite but firm. The man glanced up, his eyes widening slightly as he took us in. You're the detective, he said, his voice low. The one looking into Wade's death. Elliot nodded. And you are? James Keller, the man replied. I worked with Wade. Helped organize some of his rallies. Then you might have insights we're looking for, Elliot said as we slid into the booth. We're trying to understand who had the motive and opportunity to kill him. Keller hesitated, his gaze flicking to the other patrons before he spoke. You think Hartwell was involved? He's certainly a suspect, Elliot replied. But we're exploring all possibilities. Keller nodded slowly, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the newspaper. Hartwell hated Wade, he said. But he wasn't alone. Wade had enemies all over town, people who didn't want change, who thought equality was a threat to their way of life. Did Wade ever mention threats? I asked. Constantly, Keller said, his voice bitter. Phone calls, letters, people showing up at his rallies to intimidate him. But he never backed down. Said the fight was worth it. And the debate? Elliot asked. Did anything seem off that night? Keller paused, his brow furrowing. Wade was distracted, he admitted. Said he thought someone was trying to get to him. But he didn't say who. Just looked nervous. The diner's bell rang as another patron entered, and Keller glanced toward the door before turning back to us. "I don't know who did it," he said. "But if you're looking for people who wanted Wade gone, Hartwell's not your only suspect." "Who else?" Elliot asked. Keller hesitated again before leaning forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Greaves. Carlton Greaves. The man's slippery, but he's dangerous. Always keeps his hands clean, but he's got connections you wouldn't believe." Elliot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. Your information is invaluable." Keller didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the newspaper as we rose to leave. The streets of Stonebridge felt colder as we walked back to the car, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in my mind. Hartwell, Greaves, Calloway, Keller, all names tied to a web of secrets and lies. Elliot's silence was heavy as he drove us toward our next destination, his focus unyielding as we ventured further into the poisoned truth that lay at the heart of Stonebridge. The game was shifting, and we were running out of time. The night hung heavy over Stonebridge, cloaked in an unsettling stillness that made the distant hum of streetlights seem louder than it should have. Elliot and I had spent the better part of the evening circling the edges of the truth, piecing together fragments that seemed deliberately obscured. The tension had reached a breaking point, and now, as we prepared to confront the one person who had eluded us for far too long, it felt like we were walking toward something irrevocable. Victor Hartwell's estate loomed before us, its iron gates gleaming under the pale glow of the moon. The mansion was grand, imposing even, but it carried an air of emptiness, as if its grandeur was meant to compensate for something it lacked. Elliot had remained silent for most of the drive, his focus razor-sharp. His mind was a fortress, locked tight, and I knew better than to try and pry it open. We approached the gates with deliberate steps, the chill in the air biting at the edges of my resolve. A guard stationed near the entrance gave us a wary glance, his hand hovering near the radio clip to his vest. "Brooks," Elliot said simply, his voice calm but commanding. "We're here to see Hartwell." The guard hesitated for a moment before nodding, muttering something into his radio. The gates creaked open, and we stepped through, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on me like a physical force. The mansion's interior was just as ostentatious as I remembered, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and paintings that seemed chosen more for their price tags than their artistry. Hartwell was waiting for us in the grand sitting room, seated in a high-backed leather chair with a glass of scotch in hand. He looked every bit the picture of confidence, his posture relaxed and his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Brooks," Hartwell said, his voice smooth. "You never fail to surprise me. And Mr. Vasquez, too. I trust you're enjoying your little adventure." Elliot didn't rise to the bait. He stepped forward, his movements measured, and fixed Hartwell with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through him. "We have questions," he said simply. Hartwell chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Of course you do. But the real question is whether I'll choose to answer them." "Your choice, Mr. Hartwell," Elliot replied evenly. "But make no mistake, your silence won't protect you." The atmosphere shifted, the tension thickening as Hartwell's smirk faltered ever so slightly. He set the glass down on the table beside him, steepling his fingers as he regarded us. "Fine," he said. "Ask your questions." Elliot didn't waste a moment. "Arthur Wade." "Who killed him?" Hartwell's expression hardened, his gaze narrowing. "Wade was a fool," he said. "He thought he could dismantle the very foundation of this town with a few impassioned speeches. I warned him to back off, but he didn't listen." "That wasn't an answer," Elliot said, his tone sharp. Hartwell leaned back, his smirk returning. You think I killed him? Personally? You give me too much credit, Mr. Brooks. Then who did? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Hartwell's eyes flicked to me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a hint of amusement. You want names? Faces? Proof? The truth isn't that simple, Mr. Vasquez. Wade's death was inevitable, a natural consequence of his actions. But you had a hand in it, Elliot pressed. Whether directly or indirectly. Hartwell's smirk faded, replaced by an expression that was impossible to read. There are forces at play in Stonebridge, Mr. Brooks. Forces that you can't begin to comprehend. Elliot stepped closer, his presence commanding. Then help me understand. The room fell silent, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavy in the air. Hartwell seemed to contemplate his next words carefully, his gaze flicking between us. I didn't kill Wade, he said finally. But I knew it would happen. He made too many enemies who don't take kindly to being challenged. If you want to know who did it, you'll have to look beyond me. Names, Elliot said, his voice a low growl. Now. Hartwell hesitated, his expression tense. Finally, he let out a slow breath and spoke. Carlton Greaves. He's the one you're looking for. Wade's murder was his doing. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Greaves, Hartwell's associate, the man whose slippery demeanor had always seemed more unsettling than outright dangerous. And yet, it made a twisted kind of sense. Elliot didn't react, his focus unwavering. Why? Hartwell shook his head, his gaze dropping to the table. Because Wade threatened everything Greaves stood for. The deals, the power, the money, it was all at risk. Wade was a problem, and Greaves solved it. And you let him, Elliot said, his tone cutting. Hartwell looked up, his expression defiant. I didn't stop him, if that's what you mean. But don't pretend you wouldn't have done the same. Wade was a disruptor. He threatened the balance of this town. The balance, I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. You mean the corruption? The exploitation? The lies? Hartwell's smirk returned, cold and unfeeling. Call it what you want. But the truth is, Stonebridge survives because of that balance. Wade threatened it, and now he's gone. Elliot stepped back, his gaze never leaving Hartwell. This isn't over. Hartwell raised his glass, the smirk still etched on his face. Good luck, Mr. Brooks. You'll need it. As we left the mansion, the air outside felt colder, sharper, as if the town itself was reacting to the truths we'd uncovered. I struggled to process everything Hartwell had said, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in my mind like fragments of a broken mirror. Elliot remained silent as we walked to the car, his focus unyielding. I waited until we were driving through the quiet streets of Stonebridge before speaking. What now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He stared straight ahead, his hand steady on the wheel. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. Now we confront Greaves. And this time, there won't be any room for games. The game had shifted, the stakes higher than ever. The poisoned truth lay ahead, waiting to be unearthed, and we were racing against time to uncover it. The chill of the morning crept into my bones as Elliot and I prepared for what felt like the final confrontation. The air in Stonebridge held a peculiar stillness, the kind that settled over a town before a storm rolled in. Carlton Greaves had always been elusive, slipping through the cracks with an ease that spoke to years of practice. But Elliot had decided today was the day we dragged him into the light. The mansion stood atop a hill on the outskirts of town, its gleaming facade a mockery of the dirt and corruption that lingered in its shadow. The drive-up was tense, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. Elliot's knuckles tightened slightly on the wheel as the mansion grew larger in the distance, but his expression betrayed none of the weight I knew he carried. Elliot Brooks was a fortress, impenetrable and deliberate, and it was in moments like this that I most admired him. We pulled into the circular driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. A man in a tailored suit greeted us at the door, an assistant or maybe security. It didn't matter. The moment Elliot introduced himself, the man's expression tightened and he stepped aside without a word, leading us through the cavernous halls toward a room at the back of the mansion. Greaves was seated in what could only be described as a throne of an armchair, his posture regal and his demeanor indifferent. He wore a tailored vest over a crisp shirt, the sleeves rolled up just enough to suggest casual confidence. His grey eyes flicked over us as we entered, the corners of his mouth tugging upward in a smile that felt anything but warm. "Mr. Brooks," Greaves said, his voice smooth as silk. "And Mr. Vasquez. I've been expecting you." Elliot didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't break his stride as he crossed the room and stood before Greaves. I hesitated just inside the doorway, my stomach knotted tight. The tension was palpable, a weight that pressed down on the room like a dense fog. "Mr. Greaves," Elliot said, his tone calm but firm. "We're here to discuss Arthur Wade." Greaves raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Wade? What an unfortunate business. Truly a tragedy." "Save the pretense," Elliot replied, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We know you were involved." Greaves laughed, a low, almost melodic sound that sent chills down my spine. "Involved? Mr. Brooks, you wound me. Whatever gave you that impression?" "The evidence," Elliot said simply. "And the testimonies. You had motive, opportunity, and the means to orchestrate Wade's murder." Greaves leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the armrests of his chair. "Let's say, for argument's sake, I did. What then? What will your righteous crusade achieve?" Elliot's gaze hardened, his presence commanding. "Justice." Greaves's smile widened, a predator's grin. "Justice," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Let me enlighten you, Mr. Brooks. Justice in Stonebridge is an illusion, a tool wielded by those in power to maintain control. Wade's death wasn't an act of cruelty. It was necessary." "Necessary," I echoed, my voice quieter than I'd intended. Greaves turned his gaze to me, his expression softening into something almost pitying. "Yes, Mr. Vasquez. Necessary. Wade was a disruptor. He threatened the balance. His removal wasn't personal, it was pragmatic." "You poisoned him," Elliot said, his tone unwavering. "Or had someone else do it. You've kept your hands clean, but the trail leads back to you." Greaves rose from his chair, his movements fluid and deliberate. "And what will you do with this trail, Mr. Brooks? Expose me? Drag my name through the mud? Stonebridge won't listen. They'll thank me for preserving their way of life." Elliot didn't move, his gaze locked on Greaves. "You're wrong. Wade's voice was louder than you realize, and the truth won't be silenced." Greaves's smile faded, his expression hardening into something cold and dangerous. You think you've won, Mr. Brooks. But you're out of your depth. This town is mine, its people, its systems, its future. Wade was nothing more than a pebble in the road. Elliot stepped closer, his presence overpowering. You underestimate the power of change, Mr. Greaves. Wade's voice may be gone, but his legacy isn't. The room fell silent, the weight of Elliot's words pressing down like a storm. Greaves's gaze flicked to me, then back to Elliot, and I saw the faintest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. You're playing a dangerous game, Greaves said finally. You won't like the consequences. Elliot didn't respond, his silence more powerful than any retort. He turned and walked toward the door, motioning for me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, then hurried after him, my mind racing with everything that had just transpired. Outside, the air felt cleaner, sharper, as if we'd emerged from a suffocating cloud. Elliot didn't speak as he climbed into the car, his focus unyielding. I waited until we were driving down the hill before breaking the silence. Do you think he'll act? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, but his expression remained calm. He doesn't need to act. He's already done enough. And we have enough to bring him down? I pressed. Elliot's gaze flicked to me for a brief moment before returning to the road. We have the truth. Whether that's enough remains to be seen. The drive back to the town center was quiet, the weight of what we'd uncovered pressing down on us. Greaves had revealed himself not just as a murderer, but as a symbol of everything Wade had fought against, a system built on exploitation, corruption, and lies. And yet, there was a glimmer of hope in Elliot's resolve, a quiet strength that refused to back down. Back in town, we stopped by the community center where Wade's supporters had gathered to discuss plans for continuing his work. The room buzzed with energy, the people inside united by a shared purpose despite their grief. Eleanor Wade stood near the front, addressing the group with a steady voice that carried both pain and determination. Elliot didn't interrupt her speech. He waited until she finished, then approached her quietly. I followed, my heart heavy with the weight of everything we'd learned. We've found the truth, Elliot said simply. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes searching his face. And what do we do with it? Elliot hesitated, then replied, we use it to push forward. To ensure Wade's work doesn't end here. She nodded slowly, her expression softening. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. For everything. Elliot didn't respond, his silence a testament to the weight of what lay ahead. I watched as he stepped away, his focus already shifting to the next steps. The ripples of Wade's work were spreading, and the poison that had infected Stonebridge was finally being exposed. The rain started to fall as Elliot and I pulled into the parking lot of the Stonebridge Civic Hall. It wasn't the gentle kind that promised renewal, it was cold, relentless, and heavy, like the town itself was mourning the weight of truths unearthed. Every raindrop that splattered against the windshield felt like the tick of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Elliot hadn't said much since our confrontation with Greaves the night before. His mind was a fortress, impenetrable and inscrutable, but I knew the fire in him burned brighter than ever. The hall was lit, a beacon against the gloom that swallowed Stonebridge whole. Inside, the space buzzed with quiet anticipation as members of the community gathered to discuss Wade's legacy and what it meant to fight for change. It was as though his spirit lingered, urging those he had inspired to carry his torch forward. Eleanor Wade stood at the podium, her presence commanding despite the grief that darkened her eyes. She spoke with a conviction that echoed her husband's, her words weaving a tapestry of hope and determination. Elliot leaned against the back wall, arms crossed and eyes steady. He was watching, listening, not just to Eleanor's speech, but to the movements and murmurs of the room itself. Elliot's instincts were sharp, and tonight they were honed to perfection. I stood beside him, the weight of the night pressing down on me as I scanned the faces of the crowd. There was a palpable tension hanging over the room, expectation, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. Stonebridge was at a crossroads, and tonight felt like the moment it tipped toward one path or another. Eleanor concluded her speech with a call to action that drew applause from the crowd, but it was subdued, cautious, as though the room itself knew the fight ahead was steeped in shadows. As she stepped down from the podium, Elliot pushed off the wall and approached her, his movements deliberate and calm. "Mrs. Wade," he said, his voice soft but firm. "May I have a word?" She nodded, her posture straightening as though bracing for whatever Elliot might say. They stepped to the side, and I followed, the rain outside pounding against the windows in rhythmic protest. "We have enough," Elliot said without preamble. "Enough to expose Greaves and Hartwell. Enough to bring the truth to light." Eleanor's expression tightened, her grief bleeding into resolve. "And what will that achieve? Will it bring Arthur back? Will it undo the damage they've caused?" Elliot didn't flinch. "No. But it will prevent them from doing more. It will dismantle the system they've built on lies and corruption. It will pave the way for change." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for something unspoken. Finally, she nodded. "Do it." Elliot turned to me, his blue eyes piercing in their intensity. "Miguel, the files." I nodded, my hands trembling as I retrieved the folder from my satchel. It was thick with evidence, letters, maps, testimonies, all painstakingly gathered over days of relentless investigation. It was the truth, raw and unyielding, and tonight it would be wielded. Elliot stepped back toward the podium, the folder tucked under his arm. The crowd quieted as they saw him approach, their murmurs fading into silence. Eleanor joined me at the side, her hands clasped tightly as she watched Elliot take the stage. For a moment, he stood there, his presence commanding but understated. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on faces both familiar and unfamiliar. Then he began to speak, his voice steady and resolute. "Arthur Wade fought for change," he said. "For justice, for equality, for the soul of this town. He fought because he believed Stonebridge could be better, because he believed in you. But his fight was cut short. His voice was silenced. And tonight, I'm here to make sure the truth is heard." He placed the folder on the podium, opening it with deliberate movements. Victor Hartwell and Carlton Greaves were complicit in Wade's murder. They orchestrated it, funded it, and covered it up, all to protect the systems that benefited them. Systems built on exploitation, division, and lies. The room erupted in murmurs, shock and anger rippling through the crowd like a wave. Eleanor stiffened beside me, her grief replaced by fury as the weight of Elliot's words sank in. "I have the evidence," Elliot continued, his voice rising above the noise. "Evidence that exposes their crimes and the network of corruption that has poisoned this town for years. It's all here. And tonight, I'm giving it to you, to the people Wade fought for, to the people who deserve justice." He stepped back, his gaze sweeping the room as the crowd surged forward, their resolve ignited. The truth had been laid bare, and now it was up to Stonebridge to decide what to do with it. The scene was chaos, voices shouting, emotion spilling over, and the relentless pounding of rain against the windows. Eleanor stepped forward, her presence commanding as she joined Elliot at the podium. Together, they faced the crowd, their unity a testament to the strength of Wade's legacy. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, a mix of pride, grief, and hope, as I watched the scene unfold. Elliot had done what he set out to do, and now, the rest was in the hands of Stonebridge. As the night wore on, the storm outside began to subside, its fury replaced by a quiet calm. The crowd dispersed, their voices carrying fragments of determination into the streets. Eleanor lingered at the podium, her gaze fixed on the folder as though it held the essence of everything Arthur had fought for. Elliot joined me near the back of the hall, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said simply. I nodded, the weight of the moment settling over me. "Do you think it'll change anything?" His gaze shifted to the windows, where the first rays of dawn were beginning to pierce through the remnant of the storm. "It has to." And with that, we stepped into the quiet streets of Stonebridge, the truth hanging heavy in the air. The town had been cracked open, its secrets exposed, and now, it faced a choice, to heal or to succumb to the shadows. As we walked away from the Civic Hall, the sun began to rise, casting the town in a golden light that felt almost surreal. Stonebridge would never be the same, and neither would we. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, the belief that, perhaps, change was possible. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey through the poisoned truth. We hope you enjoyed uncovering the layers of mystery, corruption, and justice in Stonebridge. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to BookBound Audio for more immersive stories that captivate your imagination. Stay tuned for our next tale, a new adventure awaits.